If you have problems in life, you look for answers, right? But could you believe that the answers to the most complicated dilemmas of our existence have actually been there for 800, 900 years in this literature of the Jewish people? And today we're going to talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about, and we have an expert on the subject. Yes, filosofía judía medieval. Welcome. We have Elmore here. This is Ezequiel Antebi Sacca, who is a specialist in Jewish philosophy and thought, and he is a rabbinical student. He works at Menorca, which is one of the Jewish study centers that has considerable influence in Latin America. He is an educator, Morel, as I mentioned earlier, and there's a curious aspect, which is that he is also an active participant in what is known as interreligious dialogue. That is to say, his perspectives on all the topics that concern human existence are ones we could hear in this live session. And I would also like to tell you that you can find him on Twitter. I will leave his account in the description of this video. And welcome, Ezequiel.
Thank you for the invitation and for being here. I hope our discussion will be useful to everyone, since these topics can be abstract and complicated. When people hear theology or metaphysics, they often wonder what we're talking about, and they get scared, but we'll see that they're not. These are concrete things, practical as well for all of our lives.
That's right, and very relevant for today. There are many people who truly want answers to problems that have already been solved, or at least interesting approaches. But I would like to start by explaining a bit about medieval Jewish philosophy. Are there other Jewish philosophies? How is it approached? That is, what were the factors that led to the development of this particular field? Historical factors, cultural ones? How did medieval Jewish philosophy come about?
Very well. Here we need to define what philosophy is, what Jewish means, and what medieval means. Let's start with the last one, medieval. Let's situate ourselves in time. When we talk about the medieval period in the context of the history you study in school or university, what are we talking about? We're talking about the period from the fall of the Western Roman Empire at the end of the 5th century up to either the fall of Constantinople or the discovery of America around 1400. In the Jewish context and in the context of Jewish philosophy, we can say that the endpoint is the same date. But instead of saying it's because of the discovery of America, can we say it's because of the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by the Catholic monarchs? But the starting point would have to be a little different. We can say, generally speaking, that the beginning of medieval Jewish philosophy occurs in the middle of the 9th century. That is quite a while after the fall of Rome, quite a while after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, or the writing of the Mishnah and even the Talmud. And the most important, most well-known figure, although not the first Jewish philosopher, is Saadia Gaon, who, as the name indicates, was a Gaon. That is, someone who lived after the time of the Talmud and after those who finished compiling the Talmud. Now, we're talking about where Saadia Gaon lived. He was born in Egypt, but later emigrated to Baghdad. And he was the Rosh Yeshiva, the rabbinic leader of the yeshivot, the most important Jewish study centers of that time. I mean, we're not talking about someone that nobody knows, who suddenly appears out of nowhere, but rather a very important religious figure of that time. And even today, his books are still studied in yeshivot around the world. Now let's look at the context, if you will, of the thinking of that time. Why did Saadia Gaon suddenly start writing books on philosophy? There will be two major issues, or rather challenges, that he will try to address. One is internal and the other is external. The internal one is that there will be a group of Jews, the Karaite Jews, who reject what is called the oral Torah and who will begin to raise objections to traditional rabbinic Judaism, which is the one we follow. And then there will also be another great challenge, which is the Muslim world, the criticisms from Muslim and Islamic philosophy and theology toward the Jewish world, Jewish thought, and Jewish practice. In the face of those two great challenges, because normally Jewish philosophy is also a dialogue with Jewish sources. Here I'm going to look at what Jewish philosophy is with Jewish sources and with Jewish life, but also with the outside world, with what's happening outside, with the cultural environment. Saadia Gaon will be trying to respond to those two great challenges. And throughout history, we will see that Jewish philosophy is always a reaction to the outside world. And also, in some way, it helps shape the outside world as well. That is the beginning of medieval Jewish philosophy. Just so we have some context, we can divide medieval Jewish philosophy into three major stages, and then I'll let you wrap up this great introduction. The first stage is from the origins with Saadia Gaon up to a figure that probably everyone has heard of at some point, Maimonides, the Rambam, who lived where? He was born in Cordoba, which was Muslim Spain at that time, not Christian Spain, and later he would emigrate to several places, always within the Islamic world. He would mark a turning point not only because of the importance of Maimonides as a figure and his philosophical and religious stature, but also because a historical process would begin, which is the reconquest of Spain by the Christians over the course of several centuries. And that would mean that until the time of Maimonides, if you look at the map, the vast majority of Jewish philosophers lived in the south of Spain, what today would be the south of Spain, which was Muslim Spain. I repeat, no, Sepharad al-Andalus. From that moment on, around the year 1150 and onwards, they start to go on the map of that first route upwards to the north of Spain, to what today would be Catalonia, to the south of France, the region of Provence. And that's where the next stage will begin, which we can call the post-Maimonides stage, which will be from around 1150 or 1200 until 1492, to set an endpoint, as mentioned, the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And there we can say this stage of medieval Jewish philosophy, quote unquote, ends. We are already entering another historical moment.
Look, I'm currently doing a master's in Jewish philosophy, and one of the, let's say, issues that many people in the field encounter, it's defining what Jewish philosophy is. Like, how can it be explained? Because what is it? If a philosopher is Jewish, does his philosophy become Jewish philosophy? Or if a person isn't Jewish, but what he proposes is philosophy from Jewish sources, is that Jewish philosophy? That is, how would you explain it? Why medieval? Okay, you explained to us the context in which these frameworks particularly arise, and maybe you could also explain what characterizes them compared to other periods in the philosophical developments of the Jewish people. But how could this be defined, and particularly the medieval period?
Very well. Maybe the best way to frame it for me is to think about what goal and what limits we're talking about. This person is doing philosophy, but it's not Jewish philosophy. Alternatively, it's something a Jew does, but not philosophy. There are a lot of philosophers of Jewish origin, but their philosophy has nothing to do with Judaism. For example, Karl Popper, a philosopher of science who talks about and has books on politics, on science, on what knowledge is. But nowhere in his extensive bibliography does he talk about Judaism or the Jewish people or Jewish sources. Therefore, I believe there is no way to say that he is a Jewish philosopher. Now, let's suppose, just as an example, that Popper had been a Jewish person, Orthodox, practicing traditional, with a kippah, with a hat, with payot, and so on. But his books are exactly the same as the ones he wrote. In other words, in his life, he is a practicing Jew, but his books do not reflect that. So, I wouldn't say that's Jewish philosophy either. It doesn't mean it's not philosophy, it's just missing the Jewish part, okay? It doesn't mean it's bad. It can be spectacular and interesting. It's not Jewish philosophy. Now, on the other extreme, we can say that it's Jewish, but it's not philosophy. And there we might also see the medieval aspect. If I take the books of the Tanakh, for example, obviously there are reflections on the meaning of life, about God, about history, about the meaning of being Jewish, about the relationship between people, about morality, about what is the good life. There are a lot of metaphysical and ethical reflections throughout the Hebrew Bible, and yet the vast majority of us wouldn't think of that as philosophy. Why? Because, for example, everything in the Pentateuch is written almost entirely in a narrative way, or at most as laws, but not in an orderly, systematic way, with a structure like the one we would see in a philosophy book. If one wants to be a bit more generous, one could say, well, maybe what is called sapiential literature, which talks about wisdom, for example, Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, or from another perspective. Maybe even Shir Hashirim, the Song of Songs, not to mention Job, or Mishle, Proverbs, do seem to be closer to what we think of as philosophy. But the reality is that if you start reading them, they are either poems or short phrases, proverbs, just as Mishle says, for example. And finding a systematic structure in those books, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's quite complicated. And they have another interesting characteristic, which is that in most cases, we don't necessarily know who wrote them. Yes, we know tradition attributes them to an author, but we don't have that personal voice of someone speaking saying, I think this, and this. Rather, they are part of the library of what is the Torah, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. That is from a super broad library that has a lot of voices. To clarify, since they are the Word of God, they are not expressing personal opinions. Having those two extremes, if you want to put it that way, what is Jewish philosophy? We can say that it is systematic thought, ordenado, that reflects on Jewish sources and Jewish life, and on those same 2 points, that is Jewish sources and Jewish lives, but also on more universal matters, the meaning of life, the meaning of the world, the meaning of history.
I want to follow that idea. One of the most striking examples, as you mentioned, is Maimonides. Maimonides marked a turning point, to the point that they even translated him into Latin. And I have met Catholic priests who have studied him in Latin, because even today, after almost a millennium, practically almost, so my question is, I would like to steer the conversation more now toward the universal aspect, as you say. Many people in our audience are not Jewish, so they might say, well then, what does Jewish philosophy have for me if it's Jewish for Jews, as you just told me? But you just mentioned that it addresses questions that are really very big, and I would like to understand some examples so that the audience can get an idea of this. Why would a way of thinking from 800 years ago, or ideas from back then, be relevant to today's world, and especially to today's problems? Wouldn't there be a big imbalance here, or is there an example?
Well, I think the most relevant idea, it's a general concept, but I think it appears in many Jewish philosophers, and I believe it is still relevant today. It's the idea that the dichotomy often drawn between faith and reason, or between intellect and religion, is misguided. And it's an idea held by both religious people from different religions and non-religious people, atheists or agnostics, who see that there seems to be a contradiction. If I have faith, it's because I can't prove or know it, and even though it goes against reason, I still have faith, even though it may seem absurd, ridiculous, and makes no rational sense. And at the same time, in the same way, everything that is rational seems to be the only thing that is true. No, this idea doesn't work. Let's put it this way, with the assumptions of most medieval Jewish philosophers, for example, Maimonides. Since you mentioned it, they say no, there is a harmony between faith and reason. There is a harmony between intellect and religion or spirituality. There is no contradiction, and that harmony has to lead us to two things. First, to understand what the limits of reason are, and not to try to explain with reason things that cannot be explained with reason. And not to claim that something without a demonstration or proof has been proven. To say that I proved it just because it makes me feel good about myself or my ideas, but rather to recognize, well, maybe I don't have such a clear proof for this. And on the other hand, also in some way, to control religion through reason. That is, a religion that is based on superstition or on magic or on ideas of a world that is inexplicable and mysterious and that has no kind of logic or sense. And doing things just because, well, they're written, so you have to do them, and I have no idea why, but that's not right. You need to use reason, intellect, understanding, and analysis and dig deeper. Why do I do what I do? How does the world work? And that brings me to a point that I think is essential. Nowadays, there's a lot of debate, and I don't really understand why about this. Religion can never be against science, good science, well done science. On the contrary, science, when you study how the world works, what the laws of nature are, when you see what the cosmos is like, what the universe is like, what ecosystems are like, we should be amazed. Instead of rejecting all that knowledge because it seems to contradict some idea we have, something that religion instilled in us, that this is just how it is. For example, the discussion about the theory of evolution, or about the Big Bang, or about whether the world was created or not. So we already have a preconceived idea, so we close ourselves off to knowledge, and maybe on the contrary, study a science book. Observe creation's wonders, how the world works, and the laws of nature we discussed earlier. That should inspire you religiously. Closing ourselves off to that would make us lose the richness of the world. It would make us lose the richness of divine creation. It should bring us closer to God, not distance us from God. And I think that's a point that is very clear in medieval Jewish philosophy, among most Jewish philosophers. Nowadays, unfortunately, due to historical developments that are not relevant here, it seems that people want to pit these two worlds against each other, the world of religion and the world of science. When? What could be better than a scientist inspired by a religious feeling, or a religious feeling inspired by science?
Wow, you hit the nail on the head because that's truly one of the big problems or focuses of this generation. In fact, that's one of the things that impacted me the most. I come from a Jewish education where it's not so dichotomous because I understand what you're saying. If it's philosophy, it can't be spiritual. They seem to contradict, but it's really a spectrum. Actually, for those who are watching this, in Judaism, emuna, what we call faith, is a subject of study. How can you study faith? Well, that's the approach of Judaism. It's using your mind to explain things and vice versa. It's a whole system, which is why I'd like you to check out more content from Ezequiel Antebi Sacca. In fact, he has a series of videos on one of the podcasts of a guest we had last time. I saw you there explaining from Philo of Alexandria to later periods. I also invite you to watch this. And well, I'll leave you here with a little taste of what medieval Jewish philosophy is. There's so much to talk about, as you noticed. Just imagine centuries developing this. And well, that's all. Warm regards.